You know that feeling when you're watching world news and it just feels fake simple? Country A bad, country B good. We put sanctions, they lose, we win. Next story. But then months go by, and prices are higher where you live, energy is more expensive, supply chains are messed up, and somehow the people those sanctions were supposed to crush are still standing. Maybe weaker, maybe more isolated, but not gone. What if I told you this isn't a bug? It's literally how economic warfare has always worked. And what if I told you we've seen this movie at least 3 times already? With Napoleon, with the Soviet Union, and now with the modern West. Different players, different technology, same pattern. The sanctions spiral. It starts as a clean idea. We won't trade with them. We'll cut them off. Their economy will crack. They'll be forced to surrender or collapse. But that's not what actually happens in the real world. What really happens is you choke them. They improvise. You squeeze harder. They build side doors. You cut them out. They build their own version. And step by step, the power of your weapon, sanctions, gets eroded. The more you use it, the more you train the world to live without you. Rome did it with grain. Napoleon did it with trade bans. The Soviet Union was boxed in with embargoes. And today, the West is playing the same game on a global scale with finance, SWIFT, reserves, energy, tech exports. The twist? The tool that broke your enemies always comes back to bite you. Let's start with Napoleon, because this is where the modern version of economic warfare really snaps into focus. Napoleon didn't just want to beat Britain on the battlefield. He wanted to starve it. At that time, Britain was like this small, annoying island with a gigantic navy and a ridiculous ability to make money. They were the financial powerhouse, the trading hub. Napoleon knew he couldn't land his troops there easily. The Royal Navy made that suicidal. So he did the next best thing. He tried to bankrupt them. Enter the continental system. Sounds sophisticated, right? In practice, it was basically, nobody on the European continent is allowed to trade with Britain. If you trade with them, you're trading with the enemy. We ban their ships, their goods, their merchants. We cut them off from our markets. This was economic warfare, version 1. On paper, it made sense. If you deny Britain access to Europe, a massive market, you hurt their exporters, their merchants, their tax base. No money, no navy, no empire. But here's the problem with big, clean ideas. Real life is messy. Europe depended on British goods. Traders wanted money, not ideology. Smugglers saw opportunity. Ports that had lived off commerce for generations were not just going to sit there and say, sure, we'll starve for the emperor. So what happened? Smuggling went insane. People faked papers, rerouted ships, used neutral flags, bribed officials. Whole coastal economies pivoted to illegal trade because that's where the profit moved. Napoleon's system became this giant game of cat and mouse that drained energy, created corruption, and never fully worked. And while he's trying to hold this massive economic wall in place, what's going on inside his empire? Strain. Merchants are angry. Some industries suffer because they relied on cheap imports. Allies are frustrated. Client states resent the pressure. Local economies twist themselves into knots to adapt. So who actually got weakened more, Britain or Napoleon's system? Britain definitely took hits, but they had a navy. They opened new markets. They leaned harder into overseas trade. And slowly, over time, the pressure of maintaining this no-trade rule hurt continental Europe more than it broke Britain. What's interesting is this spiral. Try to crush enemy with sanctions. Enemy adapts. You tighten. They build workarounds. You put more political capital into enforcement. Your own system frays. Sounds familiar? It should. Because now we jump forward to the Cold War. The Soviet Union didn't just face military rivalry. It lived under permanent economic pressure. Embargoes, tech restrictions, export controls, limitations on who they could trade with, especially in high-tech areas. The West basically said, you can sell oil and raw materials, but good luck getting our advanced tech. Good luck accessing our finance. We're going to restrict what you can buy, who you can sell to, and what kind of deals you can make. Again, on paper, it's clean. Restrict their access to capital and tech, and you slow their growth. Slow growth means weaker military, weaker ideology, weaker influence. And in fairness, it did hurt. The USSR had to build its own version of everything. Its own tech, its own alliance network, its own block of countries to trade with. It had to drain massive resources into copying, reverse engineering, or replacing what it couldn't buy. Instead of efficiently plugging into global markets, it lived inside an artificial bubble, a controlled economy with controlled trade, under constant external pressure. Sure, they had allies, but it was nowhere near as flexible as being plugged into a global system. The Soviet system ended up with shortages, inefficiencies, and a chronic need to sacrifice consumer comfort for military and industrial goals. Did sanctions cause the collapse? No. Internal rot, corruption, bad incentives, and political rigidity did most of the heavy lifting. But economic warfare pushed them harder, faster, into the wall. It made everything more brittle. When oil prices dropped, when internal demands rose, when reforms were attempted, there was no healthy, resilient economy underneath to absorb the shock. They'd spent decades in defensive mode, building a fortress economy, and when the walls cracked, there was nothing fresh behind them. So again, same pattern, upgraded. Squeeze enemy with economic pressure. They turn inward, build a parallel system. You assume they'll break quickly. They don't. It drags on for decades. The cost of maintaining the pressure becomes part of your own system too. And today, welcome to the 4K version of economic warfare. Sanctions in the digital, globalized, financialized era. Here's where things get wild. Because now, the West, mostly the US and its allies, doesn't just control some trade routes or some tech exports. It sits on top of the global financial plumbing. The dollar is the reserve currency. Major banks clear transactions in New York and London. Payment systems and messaging networks like SWIFT run through Western hands. Global institutions, rating agencies, legal systems, they're mostly wired into Western frameworks. So when modern sanctions get rolled out, they're not just like, we won't buy your stuff. They're more like, we will delete you from the financial internet. You freeze reserves, you block banks, you ban companies from doing business, you threaten third parties with penalties if they dare trade with the target. You cut countries off from investment, tech, insurance, shipping, even spare parts for planes, cars, energy systems. And again, on paper, it sounds devastating. We'll isolate them, their currency will crash, their economy will shrink, the people will turn on their leaders, they'll be forced to obey or collapse. Sometimes, that does cause serious pain, no question. Ordinary people feel it the hardest: inflation, shortages, unemployment. But here's the part nobody really wants to look at too closely. The more you use sanctions like this, the more you are training the world to build an alternative system without you. Think about it. If you're a small country watching this from the side, and you see one regime after another getting frozen out of the global system, what are you thinking? You're thinking, okay, we might not like those guys, but if we ever cross the West, they could flip the switch on us too. Maybe we should have a backup plan. Backup plans mean new payment systems, more trade in other currencies, building reserves in things you control, not just in dollars or euros, buying energy, food, tech from partners who are less likely to sanction you, cooperating with other problem children in the system. Slowly, awkwardly, painfully, the rest of the world starts to build workarounds. At first, they're small. A bilateral deal here, a new bank mechanism there, a regional agreement, a local payment platform, some commodity deals in non-Western currencies. But remember the spiral. It doesn't flip overnight. It builds. You sanction one country, they adjust. You sanction more. Others get nervous. You start using financial power routinely. Alternatives multiply. You threaten third parties. They say, maybe we should hedge our bets. And very quietly, the thing that made your sanctions so powerful, your total dominance of the economic system, starts to erode. Napoleon lost moral authority and economic flexibility, enforcing his no-trade system. The West lost some moral high ground and flexibility during the Cold War as it clamped down on half the world's economy. Now the modern West is using the full arsenal: banking, currency, tech, trade, reserves. And you have to ask, at what point does the weapon start dulling? There's another layer to this: blowback. When you sanction aggressively, you don't just punish the target, you punish anyone who needs what the target produces: energy, food, metals, cheap labor, rare earths, gas, oil, microchip, software, whatever. So suddenly, companies in your own countries face supply shortages, prices spike, industries struggle, inflation jumps. You sell sanctions as costless punishment to the public, and then they start paying more at the pump, at the store, on their electricity bills. Napoleon's Europe felt that. The continental system made goods more expensive on the continent. People blamed Britain, of course, but they also quietly blamed Napoleon. The Cold War made Western taxpayers fund massive military budgets, aid, subsidies, while also paying extra costs for duplicated systems. Today's economic warfare, from energy sanctions to tech bans, shows up as higher prices and more instability in Western economies too. It's not free. Every round of sanctions is basically a bet that the other side will break faster than your side does. But what if that doesn't happen? What if the target adapts, reorients its trade, survives the initial shock, and then starts building a hardened, sanctions-resistant economy? Now you're stuck. You can't easily lift sanctions because you've told your people this is a moral fight. You can't escalate indefinitely without risking a hot war or a major global fracture. But you also can't admit that your ultimate leverage is shrinking because the rest of the world is learning to live with less of you. That's the sanctions spiral. Launch economic warfare. Enemy adapts. You double down. They harden, diversify, and partner up. You triple down. Your own system absorbs the blowback and slowly loses its monopoly. But here's the scariest part for you and me. You don't get to stand outside of this story. When sanctions become the main foreign policy tool, regular people pay the hidden cost. Napoleon's peasants, traders, and small towns paid. Soviet citizens paid for the fortress economy. Western workers, consumers, and savers are paying now with higher costs, volatility, and a system that's quietly being rewired under their feet. And once again, nobody comes on TV and says, by the way, we're in a sanctions spiral that might fundamentally weaken our long-term position. Instead, they say, it's for democracy, it's for freedom, it's for security. It's only temporary. Maybe some of that is true, maybe not, but the math underneath doesn't care. If you push economic warfare long enough against enough major players, you're telling the world, we are unstable, we are dangerous to depend on, you need insurance. And when enough countries decide to get that insurance, your ability to dictate terms wears off. Napoleon's Europe eventually turned on him. The Soviet Union's bloc ultimately cracked. The West's current dominance is not some permanent law of physics. So where does this go? We're probably somewhere in the middle of the story. Phase 1. Sanctions work like a shock weapon. The first big uses are devastating. Nobody expects it, nobody's ready, the target gets hammered. Phase 2. The world starts adapting. Sanctioned states cooperate. Neutral states invent side channels. New tech is used to route around restrictions. People get creative. Phase 3. The weapon becomes overused. You start threatening, sanctioning, blacklisting so many actors that the fear shifts from we must obey to we must find alternatives. Phase 4. The system fragments. Multiple trading and payment zones form. Your sanctions still hurt, but they no longer decide the entire outcome. Phase 5. The weapon that once secured your dominance now locks you into certain behaviors and alliances while others move on. Right now, the West is somewhere between Phase 2 and 3. Sanctions still bite hard, they still have real power. But the adaptation phase is advanced. Countries are experimenting with non-dollar trade, alternative payment systems, local currency swaps, regional financial institutions, digital currencies, and new settlement tech. It's messy. It's not a clean, instant end of the dollar or any of that dramatic headline stuff. But it is movement. Slow, grinding, structural movement. And you have to ask, how many Napoleons does it take for us to realize that you can't base your entire power strategy on trying to economically strangle everyone you dislike, without eventually strangling your own influence too? Napoleon believed Europe would obey his decree forever. The Soviet leadership believed their system could hold under pressure forever. Modern Western leaders talk like their sanctions toolbox will always work the same way it did the first few times they opened it. History suggests otherwise. Every time you weaponize something that used to be neutral, trade routes, finance, currencies, tech standards, you win in the short term. But in the long term, you push people to create something you don't control. So the question is not, are sanctions good or bad? The question is, at what point does this spiral start cornering the people who launched it? When do energy shocks, inflation, political polarization, business uncertainty, and global fragmentation start feeding back into the West's own system so hard that voters say, wait, who is this really hurting? When does the rest of the world stop seeing the West as the stable center and start seeing it as just one more block in a fractured global economy? We don't have that answer yet. We're living through it, But if there's one thing you can take from Napoleon's failed trade war, from the USSR's fortress economy, and from the mess we're in now, it's this. Economic warfare is never clean. Sanctions are never free, and the spiral never stays under your control as long as you think it will. The moment you hit sanction, you're not just attacking someone else's economy, you're rolling the dice on your own. And whether you're a French merchant in 1810, a Soviet worker in 1980, or an ordinary person in the West today paying more for everything, you're the one living with the consequences while the big players tell you it's all for the greater good. So next time you hear the word sanctions tossed around like it's some painless moral gesture, remember the pattern? Napoleon tried to cut off Britain and ended up sawing into his own empire. The Soviet Union lived under economic siege until its system cracked from within. The modern West is using the most powerful sanctions in history and slowly teaching the world how to live without it. That's the sanctions spiral. It breaks your enemies, then it reshapes the world. And if you're not paying attention, it corners you too.